reference to the Christians, but that's considered spurious. Why? Because it doesn't fit our preconceived idea, really. There are definitely passages in Josephus, who was contemporary with Jesus. He would have been a young man during the time of Jesus' reign, or Jesus' life, and he writes about Jesus, calling him Jesus, in fact, and yet that's not accepted because those passages are questioned. Well, why are they questioned? Because we don't believe Jesus was real. And so it's convenient to question the evidence that does exist whenever we've already made our mind up about his existence. The same goes true for other instances in the Bible as well. And tonight I want to look at one that is very popular, and it surrounds the Exodus. A lot of the information I'll be giving you tonight can be found in a documentary film called Patterns of Evidence. The filmmaker is Timothy Mahoney. If you happen to be an Amazon Prime member, you can rent that on Amazon Prime. I know it's one place that you can get it, and there are other places as well. But it's Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus. And so we're going to be talking about the Exodus tonight. There's a lot of skepticism about the Exodus itself. I mean, come on. The 10 plagues, the Nile River being turned to blood, the Red Sea being divided, those things are just phenomenal. They're fantastical ideas, and because they don't fit with what we might understand as the natural order of things, it cannot have happened that way. And so one of the things that those who are critics of the Exodus do is they come to the evidence of the civilized world at the time. Does when we talk about civilizations, civilization comes whenever a people have a language, have written languages, in fact, that record things that happened in antiquity that we can still go to and read the stories that they tell and read the things that they say about other nations and about their own kings and about what is happening in their world at the time. And of course, when we talk about civilization, there's this big debate about where is the dawn of civilization. And there's two basic ideas. One is the region of Egypt, and the other is the region of Sumer. Personally, I believe Sumer is the dawn of civilization, but there's a good case to be made also for Egypt. And we make that case by saying, look at the writings that have survived to us. Stone carvings, documents even, papyrus that date back thousands and thousands of years. That says that there was a civilized people living here. And we see that in both cases. Now, where is Sumer located, you might ask? Well, if we can trust Genesis chapter 1 about the Garden of Eden being located, Genesis chapter 2 being located near the Tigris and the Euphrates, two of the rivers that are mentioned there specifically, we're talking about the Persian Gulf. We might call modern day Iran, Iraq, and that region there. The Akkadian Empire, which predates those, goes back many thousands of years, and so like the Code of Hammurabi would have come from that region, and therefore we see a civilized people definitely there. But in order to rise to that level of sophistication in a civilized society, that society must have lived or predated for some time. Now, if Sumer is correct, which there's a lot of evidence that suggests that, then the Bible saying that humanity began in the Garden of Eden is also correct, right? That doesn't mean if we see a rise of civilization in Egypt that came first, it doesn't mean that we were wrong or the Bible is wrong about the Garden of Eden. It just simply means that by the time people came to Egypt and became sophisticated enough to record stories, develop a language, even a written language, that they did that before those in that Sumer period. But the fact is they're almost simultaneous, which simply suggests that people were growing and developing. And that's a good thing. So if we turn our eyes then to Egypt, because we're obviously talking about the Exodus. We turn to Egypt and we see that there is a lot of evidence of Egypt and its rise to greatness. And of course, when we talk about its greatness, we're talking about things like the pyramids. We're talking about not just organized civilization, but an organized government. We're talking about written languages. We're talking about a highly developed religious idea. We're talking about a legal code. All of these things which we mark as, well, that's a sign of civilization. Egypt definitely demonstrates those. And when we look back on Egypt, we talk about the different dynasties. And like the first, 11 dynasties or so were what we refer to as the Old Kingdom. They go back around 4,000 to 3,000 years before Christ. So that's a long time. Egypt is a very, very old civilization. Shortly after the Old Kingdom, there was a period of chaos where we see in the Egyptian record that there is no society, as it were. It seems like there is a breakdown of society after about 1,000 years or so, as many societies in our history of the world that we can read about, that we can see. After a little while, it seems like the societies turn decadent, selfish. They implode on themselves, and that seems to be what happened at the end of the Old Kingdom. That brings us into what we refer to oftentimes as the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom starts around 2000 BC or so in the 12th dynasty. It takes us up into the 13th dynasty or so, and it lasts for about 400 years, approximately, give or take a couple of years. The Middle Kingdom then falls into chaos and disarray again. It kind of ends that Middle Kingdom period, and those times of chaos become the marker of separation, by the way, between the periods, the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, and then what would become the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom comes onto the scene somewhere around 1280 or so, and it starts with the 14th dynasty and goes until there's another time of chaos and collapse that lasts. This time, the New Kingdom, as it's referred to, only lasts around 500 years. I think I got a date wrong there. Instead of 1200, it begins around 1570 instead of 1270. 1570, and the last about 500 years or so, down to 1069, 1070, somewhere around there. And then there's this absence or a cutoff of the civilization in which we see chaos prevail in the land of Egypt. So we can mark Egypt or break Egypt up into these three particular eras of time. And the question is when did the Exodus take place? Did it take place in the Old Kingdom, in the Middle Kingdom, or in the New Kingdom? And the question is there evidence for any of what the Bible says in this prolific Egyptian record? Now, I say that kind of with tongue in cheek, because there's no doubt, if you ask Egyptologists, there's a ton or a wealth of information about ancient Egypt. The writings are there, stone carvings, tablets that have been made, paper writings, accountings that we find, not just of governmental things, but just household and domestic writings are extant to us. And when we look at that record, do we ever see Israelites in Egypt? Because you would think in a 430-year span of Israelites in Egypt, someone surely would have mentioned that there were Israelites there. Someone other than the Bible itself. Is there any kind of evidence? Is there any kind of record? And so let's turn real quickly to Genesis chapter 47, because we could go earlier and talk about God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 22 that he would have a nation and they would walk on this land, this promised land, and that promise that was made there. But he says before that happens, you would become strangers in a foreign land. And so there was an anticipation that this famine was coming and that they would find themselves in a foreign land, in this case, in the land of Egypt. So we turn to Genesis chapter 47, though, and we find that coming to fruition. Of course, we know about Joseph. We know about his brothers who sold him into slavery. We know about how Joseph is said to have saved the nation of Egypt, the 7 years of plenty, the 7 years of famine. And Joseph set everything up so that during that 7 years of famine, they would still be able to function as a society, save the people alive, because there would be bread in Egypt when there was bread nowhere else. And so it was through his wisdom, I think through the providence of God and God leading him, that he is able to set up these provisions during the 7 years of plenty to provide for the people during the 7 years of famine. It's during that time that his elderly father Jacob sends his sons to Egypt to get food. Of course, eventually Joseph is revealed to his brothers, and he says, "Bring Papa, bring Benjamin, bring everyone back. We're going to live here." So in Genesis 47, this is the record of the Jews being planted or moving to the land of Goshen. Now, if we had a map, you would look at the Nile River, and just as it meets the Mediterranean Sea, it fans out, what we call an alluvial fan, or a delta. It fans out into this delta, and that delta is referred to as the land of Goshen. It is a very fertile land because it has all of the nutrients and the fertilizers that come from upstream. Remember, the Nile flows north. It comes from upstream and flows northward to this alluvial fan. Think of Egypt as the deserts and the sands of the deserts, and yet here the Nile spreads out, and this fertile region fans out with the Nile River. And it's there that Joseph contracts with Pharaoh to allow his family to live in that prime real estate. And so the people move there. There's around 70 of Joseph's brothers and their children and their families that move to this particular place. Now, while they are there, it goes from a people that is welcomed in peace to, of course, in verses 20 and 22, they become enslaved people. There is a requirement of the Israelites, even though they are Joseph's family, they still have to buy the food that they're going to eat. And they ask Joseph, "Well, what about when our money runs out?" He says, "Well, then give your animals in exchange for food, for bread." And what happens when our animals run out? Then give your land to Pharaoh, and you become servants of Pharaoh. You will get seeds from Pharaoh. You will plant the land, and then you will give back to Pharaoh a tax to get to continue in this land. So it wasn't a free ride, but at least it was a way to stay alive. By the way, that tax, 20%. 20% had to be given back to Pharaoh, and that allowed them to keep the other 4/5 to themselves, 80% for themselves. And so they settle, they gain great possessions, and it says in verse 27 that they multiplied greatly. And this began as a peaceful sojourn of the Israelites in Egypt. But things changed, because in Exodus 1 and verse 8 it tells us that there arose a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph, right? And so he puts a heavy task burden upon them, and they become hard slaves. Now, that's what the Bible tells us. And you would think that in all of the writings of Egypt that come from that time, surely someone mentions the Israelites in the land of Goshen, or someone mentions the salvation of Joseph, or someone would mention this 7 years of plenty or 7 years of famine, or that the Israelites were slaves, or something, anything that would say the Israelites were there. Now the critic will come along and say, well, there's no evidence of this. Because in Exodus 1, verse 11, it tells us specifically that they built the storehouses of Pithom and Ramesses, right? So there's these two cities specifically that are mentioned, and that the Israelites in their slavery to the Egyptians built those cities. Well, we know where those cities are. We know when they were built. We know that those cities, for example, are in the land of Goshen, where we'd expect some sort of storehouse to be. We also know that they were commissioned by Pharaoh Ramesses II, and everything suggests that he was the most prolific building pharaoh of Egypt's history. He built great statues, mostly of himself. He raised he had these great walls that had carvings of Egyptian hieroglyphs telling the great story of his reign and all the things that he built and all the nations that he subdued. There were stele and tablets and documents that have been found from the time of Ramesses II, and he doesn't mention the Jews. He does mention the Israelites in one particular stele. He mentions the Israelites as a nation that he subdued. And the problem with that is that Israel did not organize into a nation until after the Exodus. And so that's another strike against the biblical account, because if they were already a nation during the time of Ramesses, they could not have built the storehouses of Ramses in Exodus 1 and verse 11. There is no evidence whatsoever that the Israelites or a Semite people lived in Egypt during the New Kingdom. Therefore, the Exodus is wrong. That's the critic. That's not Sam. That's the critic. I want to get that clear. But what if there was evidence of all of this? Several years ago, they began digging just south of the city of Ramesses. Ramesses, by the way, was built upon other cities, but the storehouses of Ramesses were built during that New Kingdom period. But they excavated this city called Avaris. It's a vast city, housed somewhere between 25 and 30,000 people at one time in the land of Goshen. It is an earlier settlement, however, dating back to the Middle Kingdom, not the New Kingdom, but the Middle Kingdom, far greatly predating Ramesses, right? But what's amazing is it doesn't fit with Exodus 1:11, being that they built the storehouses of Ramesses. And therefore, they say, well, these Israelites could not possibly be the Israelites that were there during the Egyptian sojourn. But in these excavations at Avaris, it appears that when these Semitic people first showed up, that it was a peaceful settlement, that everything was fine and everything was good. In the earliest graves, in the earliest homes that have been excavated, there are signs of possessions, where they brought possessions with them, or at least had great possessions with them. They're buried in fine clothes. They're buried with gold and silver at times. And these particular people were staying in Israel or in Egypt. The homes, the earliest homes, are Syrian in style. And if you're thinking, where is Syria? Remember, if you go from Egypt and the Nile River, let me draw this backwards in my mind here, and you go around the Mediterranean coast up to what we call Palestine, where the Promised Land is, and Israel and Jerusalem is, and you continue up on the northern end of the land of Palestine is Syria. And so they are Syro-Palestinian homes in Egypt during the Middle Kingdom. Also, what we found is that at that time there was an explosion of population. Well, remember, they get there with 70, but there are hundreds of thousands by the time the Exodus occurs. That suggests an explosion of population, or as he said in Genesis 47, again, that they gained, or they settled, they gained these possessions, and they multiplied greatly. 47 and verse 27. This is all happening in the regions of Goshen, which is exactly where we would expect it to be according to the Bible account. And then there's this idea of prolepsis. Prolepsis is a figure of speech in which, if you're talking about a historic event, you might ascribe to it a modern setting so that people would know what you're speaking of. For example, and I think I've used this before, in 1112, the Plains Indians set up camp in Brighton. Well, what didn't exist in the year 1112? Brighton. Brighton didn't exist here, but by saying that, you know exactly what I'm talking about, don't you? Is it very possible that the Bible is simply using Python and Ramesses in a proleptic sense? By the way, Genesis 47 and verse 11 also refers to them being in Ramesses, a city which predates Ramesses at the Exodus by 430 years. And Ramesses, remember, he was the Pharaoh that established that city, Ramesses. And so the Bible uses that very name for that very city at a time earlier than what it actually existed. And by the way, it does that with several other cities as well. For example, Jerusalem is mentioned as Jerusalem long before the history is given of when Jerusalem is conquered and peace with the Jebusites, Jebushalam, is given, and the name of the city becomes Jerusalem. So the Bible does that, and does that with this particular city during this particular era of time. And so it's very possible that by saying Ramesses in Exodus 1:11, that there's an intention of simply telling us that they built cities or storehouses in that region where Ramesses would eventually be built, but was not yet built. Could that be happening here? I think that it probably is, but that's certainly something that ought to be considered. Now, in Avaris, among the houses that they excavated, there is one particular house that they call a palace. It's huge. And this particular palace was lived in, not by a king, but by a very prominent person, but was also a non-Egyptian. We know that from the things that are found there. And scholars who do not think that the Israelites were there at that time or during the time of the Exodus agree that this particular palace was a non-Egyptian. In the courtyard of this particular palace, there are 12 tombs. And one of those tombs is bigger than all the others. In fact, that one tomb is built as a pyramid. The others are not pyramids. Inside that pyramid tomb is a statue that is around twice the size of a man. And he is given not an Egyptian haircut, but this particular statue has a Semitic haircut. He is holding in his hands one of the items is a throwing stick, similar to what we might think of as a boomerang. And it's used by shepherds to throw at their wandering sheep to get their attention, to bring them back into the fold. Egyptians were not shepherds. Israelites were shepherds, but they weren't. This particular statue has red hair, and the Egyptians are always depicted with black hair. His skin is a yellowish color, or we might say a medium tone, like the Bedouins. And he's wearing a coat that still has paint on the statue, of many colors, many different colors. But the tomb's empty. The other 11 tombs, they have bones in them. But this tomb is empty. What they find there, a lot of it, are the jewels and trinkets and stuff that they were wont to bury with their dead, but no bones. At the end of Genesis 50, verses 23 to 26, what does Joseph make his children promise him? Carry my bones back to the tomb of my fathers. If the Bible account is correct, we would not expect the bones of Joseph to be found in Egypt. Is that Joseph a Semitic ruler over Egypt who was a prominent and important person in the history of Egypt? Would suggest as much. Then there was this point at which, if the biblical account is true, these non-Egyptian or Semitic settlements around Goshen, there ought to be a point at which they're no longer welcome, but now they're viewed as slaves. About halfway through the reign of this Avara city, the bones that they're digging up are much different than the earlier bones. These bones show evidence of malnourishment. They're not buried with anything. They're impoverished. There's many more injuries with those newer graves of Avaras. What would that suggest? Maybe slavery. Their possessions are taken away from them. They're not treated and fed as well as they were before. And abusive taskmasters, breaking bones and leaving marks and scars even on the skeletal remains. That certainly fits what would happen. And then later, the graves are filled with an inordinate amount of infants. Most graveyards, if we can use that term, burial plots of the Egyptians and of the Israelites earlier in that area and others, about 25% of the graves are infants. But at the end of the time of Avaris, that jumps to nearly 50% are infants, most of which are male. Contemporary graves show also a spike in female graves over male. Just a generation later. Why? Because the male children were killed. So the evidence is there. What's amazing is those who are skeptical, again, that Avaris, yes, everything that we're saying about Avaris is absolutely true. This is information from the critics, not the Christian trying to interpret it. This is information from the critics themselves. And they're saying it looks that way, but it can't be because it doesn't fit the timeline of Exodus 1:11 that they built the storehouses of Ramses. And then finally, one other idea here is that there is a papyrus called the Brooklyn Papyrus. And this is simply a domestic scroll. It's like someone taking account of their household or the households of their whole family, and they're writing down the servants that dwell in their house. And around 70% of the names in the Brooklyn Papyrus are Semitic names, Israelite names. In fact, 2 of the names of the 12 tribes of Israel, I believe it's Manasseh and Issachar, are actually found in the Brooklyn Papyrus. These are their slaves. How many slaves do I have? I have 100 slaves, and here are their names. And that's basically what the scroll is. And most of their slaves are Jewish or Israelite slaves. But again, this can't support the Bible because that goes all the way back to the Middle Kingdom, and the critic already knows that the Israelites were there, or the Bible says the Israelites were there during the New Kingdom and not the Middle Kingdom. What else is there? What about the work of Joseph? Again, you would think if Joseph is there and he saves Israel, surely there is some evidence that Joseph was there. He saved them from famine. What we see in Egypt is that there, off the Jordan or off the Nile River, there is a man-made trench that is dug over to a reservoir, for lack of a better term. The name of that particular waterway or that stream or branch off of the Nile is referred to as the waterway of Joseph. And the waterway of Joseph dates all the way back to the Middle Kingdom. Obviously, it can't really be Joseph because Joseph was there, remember, in the New Kingdom. But this particular waterway predates the Joseph of the critics, but it kind of fits right in line with the Joseph of the Bible. When that happens, we see, from the records of Egyptian history, that what was once individual governors of their lands who were very prominent begin to reduce in their prominence and their importance, and there's one central figure, a pharaoh, who rises up and becomes more prominent than all the others. And those particular nobles or governors of their land, they're paying tribute to Pharaoh, and they're drawing water off this waterway of Joseph in order to make a living. And then that Pharaoh dies. Amenemhat the third is that Pharaoh. And in the statues that are carved of this Pharaoh are unlike any of the other Pharaoh statues, where usually a Pharaoh's face is depicted as bright, smiling, as one who is prosperous and proud and confident. This particular Pharaoh, whose pyramid is built on the banks of the waterway of Joseph, has bags under his eyes. And where the ears are normally turned like this, his are turned out like this. And people believe, even Egyptologists who do not believe in the Bible, believe the reason is that that particular Pharaoh was burdened to a heavy degree, and that he had turned his ears to the people to hear their pleas. And most people believe that that particular Pharaoh was one that saved the nation of Egypt for several generations to come. That happens to fit very well with the story of Joseph, who had the ear of Pharaoh, was able to save the nation for generations to come. And yes, he was burdened under the fear of famine that came upon them. But he had his ears turned to the plea of the people and was able to save the nation. So there's certainly evidence for the work of Joseph in Egypt, the Egyptian record as well. Is there evidence for judgment on Egypt? Look, the Bible is very clear about the plagues in the book of Exodus. Exodus 2 through 12, with all the plagues, including turning the water to blood, and culminating, of course, in the death of the firstborn. The Bible says, for example, in Exodus 35 and verse 30 or 12, 35 and 6, that the Israelites asked their Egyptian families, probably the very ones that they were serving, if they would give them gold and silver. And it says that the Egyptians, God gave favor to the Israelites. The Egyptians gave their gold and silver away. And it says in this way, the text says, they plundered Egypt. And then there has to be some sort of a sudden disappearance of, the Israelites from Egypt. Well, the critics say there's no evidence of this because there's no evidence of the Israelites in the New Kingdom during the time of Ramses for the Exodus to have taken place or for them to have been plundered of their gold and silver. It's simply not there. There is a papyrus, simply referred to as the admonitions of an Egyptian sage. This is in the Leiden Museum in Austria. And in this particular scroll, the sage writes about the river Nile being turned to blood, about death of the cattle and the herds of Egypt. It talks about crop failure. The barley was destroyed. It talks about a famine. It talks about this being the punishment of an angry God, which is interesting because the Egyptians don't believe in a single God. It's not that the gods were angry with us, but he writes that God, singular, was angry with us. And then he said that their slaves took all their gold and their silver and fled and plundered the Egyptians. The problem is this particular document does not date back to the New Kingdom. Guess where it dates? To the Middle Kingdom. All the other evidence that is accumulating. There is mentioned already the Israel stele, which is where Ramses mentions his conquest of the nation of Israel, which means that if all of this happened in the Middle Kingdom, Israel has left. They've already inherited the promised land. They've been a nation now. By the time Ramses comes along in the 1200s, it's already a nation. And it fits that Ramses would call them the nation of Israel. There's another one in Berlin called the Berlin Pedestal, which also makes reference to the nation of Israel and dates to the time of Ramses. We also know that at the end of this middle period, there was a period of chaos. It's referred to as the time of the Hyksos. The Hyksos period is that period of chaos between the Middle and the New Kingdom. And the writings about that particular time is that the Hyksos, which was another group of people that came, by the way, out of the land of Palestine, and they invaded Egypt, and they overthrew the nation of Egypt without striking a blow. Why? Well, if the Bible account is correct, then Pharaoh lost his army in the return of the Red Sea. They were a defenseless people. And the Hyksos came in. When did they come in? Maybe about 40 years later when they're driven out of their homelands. And they come down and they destroy the nation of Egypt that is weakened because its army is taken out of commission. Maybe that's when those things happened. Is there evidence for judgment on Egypt with the plagues? The critics said there's no evidence during that New Kingdom, but there is plenty of evidence during the Middle Kingdom. And then finally, let's go quickly. Just what about the conquest? You know, the first half of the book of Joshua is full of cities and towns that were conquered by the nation of Israel or by the people of Israel as they inherit the promised land. Surely some of those cities' names show up and say that the Israelites destroyed them, right? Surely the names of Jericho and Hatzor and others show up in that account. Archaeologists, critics say, well, no, sorry, here again, it doesn't fit. At the time in which the Israelites moved into the land of Canaan, according to the scriptures, using Exodus 1:11 as the time in which they left the new kingdom of Egypt, which coincides, by the way, with the late Bronze Age. When you get to Canaan in the late Bronze Age, what we find is there's no one there. There's no one in Jericho. There's no one in Hatzor. There's no one in Hebron. There's no one in Arcad. There's no one in these cities that the Bible specifically says Joshua defeated. And so Joshua is not right. And the Bible cannot be trusted. Evidence of Canaanite destruction. Even if you're not putting the Israelites in there, surely there's evidence of these Canaanite cities being destroyed, not in the New Kingdom, not during the late Bronze Age. Now, by the way, during the Middle Bronze Age, which coincides with the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, by the way, there is evidence that many of these Canaanite cities were destroyed in a relatively short period of time. But again, that can't be Joshua fighting the Battle of Jericho, because Joshua comes much later when there's no one in those cities. Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s in her excavations said that even though there are some things that look like it could be a destruction, they are not in the late Bronze Age. They're in a Middle Bronze Age, and it simply doesn't fit the timeline. And one of the things she was measuring by was the pottery. What kind of pottery was there? And what was actually found out later is that John Garstang in the 1930s found the very pottery she was looking for and had cataloged it. It was sitting in the storehouse of a museum or a university somewhere, and no one was looking at it for generations. And because Kathleen Kenyon could not find that pottery, she said it simply does not fit the timeline. But if we look at Jericho, Jericho is an amazing city. You can ride a camel in Jericho. I did that. But when you come into Jericho, the main city is on the hills around, surrounding this one. It's almost a pit, it looks like. But ancient Jericho is that pit. That's where all the digging is done. And what they found, what Garstang found, for example, in the 30s, was that the brick walls, the mud brick walls that protected the city, had fallen outwards. That underneath the brick walls, this was an amazing thing. That there's a foundation, and then there was this mud brick wall that was built around the city, and then there was this rampart, this ramp that went up to the main city wall, was also mud brick, and this rampart was covered with plaster, and about 30 feet high. Now imagine yourself in a foreign invading army, and if you make it through the first wall, the first thing you've got to do is run up this slick plastered hill while everyone on the wall above you is shooting down at you. The wall above them, by the way, is around 25 feet above that, straight up. There's not a lot of hope here. But according to the Bible account, when they marched around the city 7 times on the 7th day and blew their trumpets and gave a shout, it says the walls fell out. Now all the brick wall rubble allowed the Israelites to scale those slick ramparts and march into the city. Do you know the walls fell out everywhere, except there's a small section on the north part of the city where some of the poorer homes were built in between the main wall and the external wall. The wall didn't fall down in those sections. Could that be God preserving Rahab and her family alive? Lowering through the windows in that wall? Just as God has said. They've excavated down. There's many layers there. For example, there's a tower that you can stand on a bridge and look down in a pit that's probably 40 or 50 feet deep, and there's a tower that goes back before the time of Joshua. It's one of the oldest structures, man-made structures that we have found. It's an amazing find. But as you go up in layers, obviously the city gets newer and newer, new being relative to the time before. Still ancient to us, but newer and newer. And they found one particular level that has been burned, completely burned. And not just a small fire. This was a huge fire that burned and melted potteries and all kinds of stuff. And in that burn layer, they have found jars of grain storage that still have grain in it. The grain is burned. But that couldn't be Joshua, because that particular burn layer comes from the Middle Bronze Age of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. And we all know as critics, that the Bible doesn't say Joshua got there until the late Bronze Age. That burn layer after that is basically uninhabited. The later city of Jericho that Jesus would know is built around that particular tell and the hills around it. And that's the Jericho that you go see today. Why was it uninhabited? Could it be because of the curse that Joshua pronounced on anyone who would rebuild Jericho? There's also the city of Hatzor, which is also burned at about the same time as Jericho is. But again, that can't be Joshua defeating the city of Hatzor, because Joshua would come much later. Isn't it amazing how much our biases impact not what the evidence is? Everyone agrees on what the evidence is. The question is, how do we interpret that evidence? And where we begin will determine where we end. The evidence for the Exodus is truly plentiful. It is consistent, and it consistently falls during the Middle Kingdom period, which predates the New Kingdom, obviously. It doesn't fit into the assumed timeline of the critics, and that Exodus 1:11 is the crux. But if we could show that the Bible uses prolepsis and talking about sites and events, then surely we could at least say it's possible that Exodus 1:11 is talking about cities that would eventually be there, but at the time and history that it is describing was not there. And in fact, not only can we show that the Bible does that, we can show the Bible does that for the city of Ramses as well. So otherwise, everything else lines up if that prolepsis is used. In 1 Kings 6:1, as they were building or starting to build the temple, there's a reference made to 480 years earlier when they left the nation of Egypt. The Exodus was 480 years before the inception or the beginning of the building of the temple. If we put the building of the temple somewhere in the first couple of years of Solomon's reign, which happens around 975, and we count back 480 years, we end up at about 1450 to 1455, somewhere in that time frame, which falls pretty much in that Middle Kingdom period of the Egyptians. There's some other anomalies in the timeline, things that scholars are going to talk about and back and forth. But if you have evidence that is consistent in its timeline and its pattern and supports exactly what we'd expect to see according to the biblical account, doesn't it deserve at least a mention of a possibility instead of so many in their certainty saying that cannot be? All because of a literal reading of Exodus 1:11, which could simply be a proleptic account, as it was in Genesis 47:11. I know that was a long explanation. Look, go watch that movie. It's 2.5 hours or so. So me doing it in an hour, you are blessed. But we do want to offer an invitation for any tonight that are here. Maybe you are convinced now more than ever and you're ready to obey the gospel, or maybe you just need help with your life. You're struggling with sin or facing some temptations, or maybe just decisions that you've got to make, and you're looking for wisdom and help and strength of the congregation. We ask you to come while we stand and sing this invitation song.